machine gun components, artillery shell casings, drone warheads, parts of armored vehicles. Amnesty International says all of these were shipped from India to Israeli defense companies as Israel continues its military assault on Gaza. In a report shared with DawnNews English, Amnesty said it analyzed 2,596 shipments sent from India to Israel after October 7, 2023. The rights group argues the findings reveal a deep and profitable defense partnership, one that could expose the Indian state and some Indian companies to legal responsibility. So what exactly was exported? Where did it go? And what does international law say about supplying weapons during a war? Amnesty examined shipment-level trade records covering the period from October 7, 2023 to November 30, 2025. It identified at least 390,516 parts of military-grade small arms, including machine guns. The data also showed 564,970 components linked to explosive weapons, including artillery shell casings and drone warheads, as well as 298 parts for military vehicles. The report identified shipments of components for weapons used by Israeli forces in Gaza. These included parts for machine guns, 155mm high explosive artillery shells, and warheads for Sky Striker loitering munitions, commonly known as suicide drones. Amnesty said some of the warheads were similar to debris recovered after attacks in Khan Yunis in southern Gaza. That does not prove that every Indian-made component was used in Gaza, but Amnesty argues that sending them to companies supplying the Israeli military created a clear risk that they could contribute to serious violations. Amnesty tracked the shipments using internationally recognized customs codes for arms, ammunition, military parts, and armored vehicles. To narrow its findings, it excluded shipments that may have been intended for civilian use. It also removed items likely to be used in anti-missile defense systems, which can protect civilians from indiscriminate attacks. The remaining record were then matched with the companies sending and receiving the goods. This allowed investigators to trace how Indian-made components entered Israel's wider military supply chain, even when they were not shipped directly to the Israeli military. The report names several private, joint venture, and state-owned Indian companies. They include PLR Systems, a partnership between India's Adani Defense and Israeli weapons industry, which manufactures machine gun parts. Kalyani Systems, a subsidiary of Bharat Forge, produces artillery rounds and casings. Indo MIM manufactures firearm components, while Alpha LSEC and Aerospace Systems produces explosive warheads through a partnership involving Israel's Elbit system. The report also identifies the state-owned Munitions India Limited, which manufactures high explosive artillery ammunition. Among the Israeli recipients were Elbit Systems, Rafael Advanced Defense Systems, and Israel Aerospace Industries. All three are major suppliers to the Israeli military. Amnesty says these commercial relationships show India is not simply allowing private exports. Through state ownership and joint ventures, the government is also directly connected to the parts of the supply chain. The shipment continued after the Hamas-led attacks on Israel on October 7, 2023, in which fighters killed civilians and took hostages. Israel responded with a military campaign that has devastated Gaza and caused mass Palestinian casualties and displacement. Amnesty concluded in 2024 that Israel was committing genocide against Palestine in Gaza. Israel rejects that allegation and said its military campaign targets Hamas. The International Court of Justice has not issued a final ruling on whether genocide has occurred. It has, however, ordered provisional measures in the case brought by South Africa, requiring Israel to prevent acts prohibited under the Genocide Convention that allows more humanitarian assistance into Gaza. Amnesty argues that these warnings meant India could not ignore the risk that military exports might be used in serious violations of international law. India is not a member of the Arms Trade Treaty, which sets global rules for international trade in conventional weapons. It abstained when the treaty was adopted in 2013 and has not signed it. But Amnesty says this does not remove India's wider obligation under the International Humanitarian Law and Genocide Convention. States must not transfer weapons when there is a clear risk that they will contribute to war crimes or other serious violations. Companies also have a responsibility to assess how their products may be used. If executives knowingly supply goods that are likely to facilitate international crimes, Amnesty says questions of corporate and individual criminal responsibility could arise. The report found that India's export systems does not explicitly require companies to conduct human rights checks before military goods are approved for export. It also criticized the lack of public information about how licenses are granted, making it difficult to hold officials or companies accountable. Amnesty wrote to the Indian government and 9 companies named in the investigation in June and July 2026. It shared its findings and sought responses. According to the report, none had replied by the time of publication. Amnesty is calling on India to immediately stop the direct and indirect transfer of weapons, ammunitions, and military components to Israel. It also wants India to join the Arms Trade Treaty, strengthen checks on military exports, require companies to assess the human rights risk linked to their products. For companies, the warnings goes further. Amnesty says any businesses that discovers its products may have contributed to abuses should help provide remedies to those harmed. The report does not establish where every component was ultimately used. What it does reveal is the scale of India's role in a supply chain serving Israel's largest defense companies. And it raises a question with consequences far beyond India and Israel. When weapons are assembled across several countries, who is responsible for how they are ultimately used? For more such explainers, subscribe to DawnNews English.